Welcome, and just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available, distributed and available after the webinar if you wanted to forward it on to anyone. So welcome to Enterprise Community Partners' third session of the Southeast Resilience Academy. Today, we're going to be focusing on community resilience, a human-centered approach. I know a lot of you have been with us for 3 sessions now, but just in case you don't know me, my name is Mihir Parikh. I'm a senior program director in the resiliency practice here at Enterprise. It's great to be with you all again. Appreciate everyone joining today. And if you have been with us for the last 3 sessions, we're great to have you along this journey for the Southeast Academy. So why are we here today? We at Enterprise believe that housing reflects society's principles and priorities. In a rapidly changing climate, people are a top priority and inextricably connected to community infrastructure. In our last session, session 2, which was a cohort-only session with our cohort of owners operators of affordable housing in the Southeast, we focused on building assessments and then went into healthy building implementation and building rehab strategies focused on healthy housing to really put the focus on resident engagement and how that connects to health. As evidenced by research from Groundwork USA and others, neighborhoods that couldn't attract investment due to racist housing policies started in the 1930s are today the most vulnerable to flooding and heat waves. So today in our third session, we want to focus on community resilience, trying to right those wrongs and taking on the practice of the needs of the community along with the built environment. When opportunities are available, we'll focus on when opportunities are available to make portfolio and property upgrades in the name of resilience. How can those upgrades also solve for the other needs of the community and residents in the process? So just to give you a quick overview of where we are in our curriculum for the Southeast Academy, we're currently in our 3rd session. We have 3 more left to go, so halfway. As you can see, we have 2 more public-facing sessions, 3 more sessions total. So our next public-facing session will take place on December 2nd, focusing on navigating funding opportunities. Obviously there's a lot going on right now at the federal level in terms of monies for housing. So we'll be keeping an eye on that and obviously updating our curriculum as that begins to evolve. And then session 6, our last session of the Southeast Academy, will be held on December 16th. So looking forward to the rest of them. And we'll drop in the chat here a link to our blog where you can sign up for the rest of the sessions that are publicly available. So what are we going to be focusing on today? What are we going to learn today? So we're going to focus on the value and methods for community resilience planning and community livability, the intersection of equity in buildings, the need to design community with the capacity to face climate, social, and economic changes. And we'll also focus on storytelling. How can we harness the power of stories with our residents, our community members, to move forward in all these points that are presented here? I would also encourage everyone to take a look at Enterprise's Communities Together Resilient Community-Centered Design Guide. It's really a great story of designing for community, particularly in Puerto Rico and USVI, but definitely has a lot of applicable aspects to other communities here. So that was also dropped in the chat. Would definitely recommend everyone to take a look at that. So our agenda for today, we are, again, going to be emphasizing the mindset of accountability to community members whenever decisions are made in the name of resilience, whether they be from owners, operators, developers, or local officials. Jamie Albrecht with Enterprise is going to be taking us through our newly released community-powered resilience website, which has some tools and resources in there. And then we're going to hear from Marion McFadden with Enterprise and Marissa Ramirez with the NRDC, focusing on incorporating community needs into planning. We'll have some panel discussion and some time for Q&A as well. So with that, just want to hand it over to Jamie Albrecht with Enterprise, who manages our community-powered resilience program. She came from Enterprise from Impact 360 Alliance, an initiative inside the University of Washington to break down the barriers between researchers and practitioners in disaster resilience planning, programs, and policies. Before that, she had a long career in the federal government, wore many hats, and we're super excited to have her here and reveal and take you through our new website of resident engagement and tools, stories of how to engage the community when planning for resilience. Jamie?
Thank you so much, Mahir. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Jamie Albrecht. I am in Enterprise's Northern California office, and I manage our community-powered resilience program, which is really aimed at ensuring that people most impacted by climate change and disasters have safety, dignity, and decision-making power before, during, and after a disaster. So the first thing we did as part of releasing this program was really to build a tool to support people in accessing all the ways in which they can participate in planning for disasters, managing them as they're happening, and also the recovery process. These processes, programs, funding opportunities are really complicated and really tricky to navigate, especially if it isn't your day job. So we really wanted to create a scalable way for everyone to access this information and learn how to really engage with the people most impacted. So I'm going to share my screen now and give you a little taste of it. So I will say this is based in Northern California, so it is focused on Northern California. That said, a lot of the challenges that we have here are similar to the ones across the country. There's resources in here on dealing with extreme heat, working with communities to write mitigation plans, working with affordable housing to make upgrades for flooding. So there's a lot of overlapping material in here for our partners across the country. So we built this website in close coordination with community-based organizations, philanthropic partners, and local government to really try and solve this problem of how do we get all of these groups together, working together to support one another, and how do we really listen to the people most impacted, and how do we create relationships with the people most impacted to ensure that they have decision-making power. So I'm just going to walk through the website a little bit here. On the main screen now is kind of like a California green background with a rainbow, and it says ensuring all Californians are safe from disasters. We have some navigation at the top. One thing I'll note is that we worked really hard to offer at least Google Translate into any language spoken here in California. We're working hard to upgrade this to not be Google Translate, but to be translated by humans, so it's a little bit better, but that's the next phase of the work. So if I'm going to scroll down a little bit now, and what was up on the slide is speaking of storytelling, we really wanted to offer what it is like for people on the front lines of disasters and climate change. What's their experience in every part before, during, and after a disaster, and how do we understand what they're going through? So we have 3 stories here, one on earthquakes, one on heat, and one on wildfires. These are very specific to California, but I think that you'll find in the stories are very similar threads of what folks in your area might be going through. I'm going to scroll down a little bit more, and we have actions that people can take to really get involved. This website was really built to have people learn and then put into practice. So we have ways for people to get directly involved in advocacy, using their money or their philanthropic dollars in ways that support the people most impacted. And we really want this website to be a living document that people contribute to. So if you have ideas of what should be on here, you can join and share your experiences here. We have lots of resources and case studies, and we're still building out what that could look like. So the last thing I'll show is our resources. So we broke things down into getting started, pre and post disaster. And so you'll find in the getting started section lots of ways of really understanding how climate change and disasters function in the US, how our government handles them, how philanthropy and community-based organizations step in, and ways we're really thinking about resident-driven planning and recovery processes. So that's kind of your overview. And then we have sections on all the planning you can do before a disaster and how do you involve community members in that work. And then post-disaster similarly is how do you recover in a way that really is in line with the community's vision of what that should look like. And then so lastly, we have case studies of really great examples of community-driven planning and recovery and how community groups are really leading the way. Across the country, these case studies are from all over, and a really great way to showcase how this kind of resident-driven planning could work. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, and I'll hand it back to me here. And I'll just say you can go to communitypoweredresilience.org if you want to check it out for yourself. That's probably a little more fun than me sharing my screen and having you see it that way. Thank you.
I don't know, that was fun for me, Jamie. So thank you for sharing. We're really so excited and proud of that website. And not only that, just how the website itself is engaging and interactive and encourages you to share your own stories and really lift up the community and residents, as Jamie said, you know, how do we try to understand what people are going through instead of tell them what they're going through and use that to solve for the larger problem. So speaking of, so now we're gonna hear from Marion McFadden and Marissa Ramirez. Speaking of kind of taking resident voices and community engagement and bringing it up into community scale projects. Marion and Marissa are going to focus on that. So first off, we have Marion McFadden, who is here with us at Enterprise. You all heard from her during our first session to really help set the stage for resiliency and what do we think what do we mean when we talk about resiliency. So Marion leads our policy and resiliency development, research and advocacy at the federal, state and local level. She was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs at HUD, where she led the affordable housing and community development programs. And what she's going to be speaking to us about is helping to lead the creation of HUD's National Disaster Resilience Competition in 2014, awarding $1 billion in funding for communities to address threats, hazards, and more by engaging within their actual communities. So I will kick it over to you, Marion.
Thanks, Mihir. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back. I am going to talk about how you can achieve multiple benefits when you're designing your resilience projects. So I'm going to start with the National Disaster Resilience Competition. As Mihir mentioned, this is one of the programs that I administered in 2013 and 2014 when I was working at HUD. So at the time, after Hurricane Sandy, Congress had given HUD about $15 billion, and HUD gave most of that money out to communities that were the worst hit by a formula allocation. But HUD held back about $1 billion under the president's encouragement to use competition as a vehicle to spur innovation and best thinking. And ultimately, HUD ended up partnering with the Rockefeller Foundation and with Enterprise to create, wait for it, resilience academies. Those were resilience academies working with the jurisdictions that had had the worst of the disasters to help them learn best practices in resilience and put that together with the best of community engagement so that jurisdictions, meaning states and local governments, could work with local experts, national experts, and the people who were the most impacted by those disasters locally. The resilience academies that we did were focused primarily on large-scale infrastructure projects, but stay with me. I think that there's a lot that we can take from that to apply to working on individual buildings. For what it's worth, some of the same people who created the National Disaster Resilience Competition are running HUD today. So we may see that what's old is new again, particularly here in Washington, as we're thinking about whether we are really on the brink of getting a big infrastructure investment in housing, in looking at 150 billion or more in affordable housing dollars, and knowing that the Biden team is likely to put new resilience requirements around existing annual funds. So I think these ideas are going to come back up about achieving multiple benefits, not just making properties physically resilient to climate. The National Disaster Resilience Competition started with defining resilience. HUD said that a resilient community is able to resist and rapidly recover from disasters or other shocks with minimal outside assistance. Reducing current and future risk is essential to long-term vitality, economic well-being, and security of all communities. And by identifying future risks and vulnerabilities, resilient recovery planning can maximize preparedness, save lives, and bring benefits to a community long after recovery projects are complete. Where HUD really deviated from what the federal government had done previously was focusing on the infrastructure in a way that ensures that the social and economic characteristics that allow communities to bounce back after a disaster are also considered. So for example, the applicants in that competition needed to consider how their projects could promote community development goals, ensure meaningful public engagement and participation, and build collaborations with neighboring jurisdictions and stakeholders who are critical partners in preventing, mitigating, and recovering from disasters. For me, it was a fantastic experience in thinking about resilience holistically. The worst thing I think we can do as professionals in our careers is miss opportunities. If we're going to spend money, let's try to spend each dollar 4 or 5 times. So the first phase of this competition included 38 jurisdictions, and 95% of them, maybe even more, identified new project co-benefits after talking with their residents and local and national experts. And then phase 2 was a smaller number who went on field trips, and they viewed projects that were promoting physical, social, and economic resilience. So local architects, designers, public agency officials took these teams out on tours through riverfront revitalization and parks projects, mixed-use brownfields redevelopments, and socially minded co-working spaces in Chicago and Denver. The resulting projects that came out of this process that jurisdictions had worked on for 15 months were truly extraordinary because they really left nothing on the table. They were all in for achieving multiple benefits. So let me give you an example from your region, from Shelby County, Tennessee. Shelby County had sustained really bad damages from 2011 storms. They brought over 16 inches of rain. They had tornadoes, straight line winds across the region. So they had significant flooding, including $2 billion of damages and a lot of impact on the most vulnerable communities. So areas that were suffering from socioeconomic disadvantages, lack of resources, and limited connectivity to opportunity. So Shelby County had worked collaboratively in a cross-state regional coalition to develop something called the Green Print Plan, where they were envisioning a network of 500 miles of green space connections and 200 miles of bicycle paths and strategic framework. They were responding to needs for better transportation, recreation, health, and housing, and economic development that they heard from the residents. So here, the Shelby County residents had asked not just to be protected from flood, but to experience benefits of any new redevelopment projects every single day. They identified the need for better roads, better recreation, better access to jobs. And so this resilience project under the National Disaster Resilience Competition built on the existing plan that had been done by creating activities that would protect Shelby County from natural hazards while increasing environmental quality and socioeconomic opportunity for those residents, especially those vulnerable communities. Their winning project offered green space for flood control and flood protection, urban agriculture, recreation, vacant lot remediation to reduce blight and crime, and the creation of pathways for pedestrians and bikes. They also redesigned their streets for better access to neighborhoods with jobs, whether in cars, on foot, or on bikes. And the projects were designed to serve these multiple community needs. If you think about it, without really listening to the needs of their residents, they might have just built a big concrete wall. But because they took the time to hear from their residents about what was going on with them, they really, truly didn't miss any opportunities. So what does that mean for us in thinking about how to make individual buildings and properties more resilient? it's all about talking with the residents and listening to what they're going through. If you're talking with your residents now, one of the things that you might hear, particularly given the impacts of the pandemic, is that mental health is a growing challenge. Poverty, racism, lack of access to quality healthcare in schools, added to the stress of the pandemic, really can be brutal, and some residents may really be struggling. How can we put these things together? One way to make a building more resilient to climate change is to use green infrastructure. That's just a fancy way of saying planting trees and other landscaping. Trees and plantings add to resilience because they can help trap water during storms. They can catch dirty runoff water before it becomes a pollutant in the water supply. They increase biodiversity and they provide natural cooling, so important in the periods of extreme heat. But did you know trees also can very positively impact the mental health of residents? I once saw a bumper sticker that said something like, trees make everything better. And in fact, multiple studies seem to have proven that out. I was just reading about a German study that found that streets close to the home can reduce the risk of depression. It said that more trees immediately around the residence was associated with a reduced risk of being prescribed antidepressant medication. Looking at it, it said, our findings suggest that street trees, a small scale, publicly accessible form of urban green space, can help close the gap in health inequalities between economically diverse social groups. And of course, given how much people struggle with the cost of medication, avoiding antidepressants can have immediate economic benefits too, to say nothing of the fact that people who suffer less from depression are better able to succeed in school and at work. Trees, planting, these are cheap, easy, don't involve a lot of pre-planning to make them happen, and are a great source that can help people be healthy so that they're better able to withstand shocks and stresses, or essentially to be more resilient. That's just one example of something you could do, putting together the needs of your residents and understanding what are some of the best practices that other people are doing to deal with it. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Mihir. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marion. Yeah, I mean, I love trees. I know that the difference of just going outside and, you know, standing under a tree and breathing in that fresh tree air does make a difference. But you know, it's and we'll dive into this more in our panel discussion. But it was interesting just to see that same theme that Jamie brought up and that you're bringing up, Marion, in terms of understanding what people are going through and taking those responses, meeting people where they're at, to actually take into account to your planning, which just creates better benefits for everyone across the board. So really appreciate you sharing your insights and experience with the ground up planning. Great. Well, next we have Marissa Ramirez with the NRDC. I had to pause there because the competition that Marion was just speaking about is the NDRC. So I remember those couple of years when the competition was going on, I would always word jumble those letters in my mouth. So Marissa Ramirez with the NRDC is the Senior Community Climate Strategy Manager for People and Communities program at the NRDC. She believes meaningful change happens locally. Marissa works with neighbors and local leaders, primarily in underserved communities of color, on revitalizing communities by providing best practices and tools for a more equitable and sustainable future. She's the co-author of several resources and papers working toward just and resilient communities. Marissa?
Thanks so much, Mihir, and thanks for the focus on storytelling and hearing from communities. Jamie and Marion, really critical piece to getting to that integrated and solutions on the ground. So I work with the Spark Initiative, which I'll talk a little bit about, working with communities across the country on equitable and sustainable development. And we can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about a lot of the intersections that we started to talk about around climate change, equity, and housing in the context of some of the challenges that we're facing today. The value of community resilience and how some of our partners came to understand some of these intersectional issues. I'll briefly cover a couple of strategies around community-led resilience. I think there's a number of great tools out there, and I'll cover one or two of them. And then finally, we'll review some principles and actions that we can think about around collectively our capacity for addressing these interconnected issues. And what I want to leave us with is really that sustainability is not just about greening and cleaning poor communities of color, but that we're achieving climate goals that necessarily includes getting to the root cause of environmental injustice, related health inequity and wealth disparities, and does so in a way that considers current and future climate impacts. And as we're thinking about storytelling, if folks want to use the chat, maybe think about one way that what does climate justice or community resilience mean to you, either personally or professionally. I would love to hear how you're approaching it in your work, or maybe one principle around community resilience that's meaningful to you. And I think it's important for us to share our own stories, as we are also part of community. I know that for me, I think about my family from Puerto Rico, for instance, who were impacted by Hurricane Maria, but also, in thinking about my grandfather and my father who thought about putting solar panels on their roof. And they knew that it would really be a good investment and good environment, which is just a testament to the fact that what we know and what we do now will shape the next 40 years in the way that my people that came before me did. So ultimately, as we put people at the center, we have the chance to reimagine the measures of success beyond some of the way that we've traditionally done it in the past. So we can go to the next slide. And I think at this point, more and more people are really intrinsically understanding these interconnections as we're seeing these compounding challenges and the need for holistic solutions. Think about 2020, right? It's this defining year with converging health crises, racial uprisings, climate disasters, ever more at the forefront. And I put this graphic here on the bottom right, showing the change in wealth after a disaster by race between 1999 and 2013. If you have a chance, go check out the full infographic on The Guardian from earlier this month, basically showing that white households gain an average of $100,000 in disaster-prone census tracts. And at the same time, Black and Latino households are losing almost the equivalent. So where I'm finding hope is with all of you on the line here today, and I hope you do share your stories, who are part of really advancing these issues in communities, and we need all of you. So next slide. One of the projects that I work on in SPARK, it stands for the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge. We're a collective of over 100 national and local partners spanning multiple sectors: Atlanta, Memphis, Chicago, Denver, Bay Area, and LA. And our work is really focused on systems change to influence policies and practices that shape our cities. And you can click to go to the next animation. Because we're focused on systems change through this lens of racial equity, this is the framework here, and addressing barriers facing communities of color, building relationships and shifting power really shapes our work. Next slide. And we came to this intersection of addressing climate impacts in communities actually through focusing on historic inequity and health. And the theme was displacement for us, which is a climate vulnerability, and became the theme of our initiative. Some of our partners work around the Beltline in Atlanta or the LA River revitalization, and are facing both pressures on homes and culture. We actually released some national research working with the Urban Displacement Project and EcoAdapt on this very topic, looking at the multiple dimensions. And I put some links at the end of the slide deck as well. Looking at these multiple dimensions, there's a number of drivers, and including from historic disinvestment patterns and policies that have led to further disinvestment today, and how climate exacerbates this. And Marion talked about this as well, historic disinvestment and climate. Climate also drives now where and how we live. And you might, I know we're talking about the Southeast. So the example of Miami and climate gentrification, where affluent residents living in low-lying areas are impacted by sea level rise, moving to higher ground and putting pressure on low-income, high elevation areas. And this cycle just continues. If our development pattern is disconnected to transit or green space, housing remains inefficient and GHGs increase. So the result, climate can lead directly to displacement. You could lose your home in a storm or a fire, but also indirectly when there's these green investments that come in that are actually meant to protect us. And we can go to the next slide. And it's really no surprise that we found strong evidence that Black and Brown communities are most impacted by these drivers. These is just a sample of some of the data that we found showing the implications to energy or climate related upgrades, especially in affordable housing, that even though we want to decrease energy costs, we have to really be mindful of rents not going up as a result. Next slide. So I'm just going to talk briefly about two approaches to community resilience. And the first is the community-centered climate vulnerability assessment. And I think there are some similarities to other tools that have been shared, but I really just want to share that this can be a rapid exercise. And really, we want to highlight that we in community are also our own experts, and that these processes don't have to be technical processes done by folks on the outside. And it sounds technical, a climate vulnerability assessment, but it's simple. The goal is really to work with communities, work with residents, work with leaders, and the strategies that they identify, like we want to create more resilient, affordable housing, or we want to preserve culture, and bring them together around the conditions in the community. So scientifically, we have this equation of vulnerability determined by the intersection of what risks we are exposed to, how sensitive we are to them, and our ability to withstand them. And for this tool, we're really also integrating the non-climate impacts like the social determinants of health, the mental health piece that Marion talked about, racial equity or displacement. So next slide. And the best, why are we doing this? The best way to address these joint challenges of climate and inequity is to adopt climate policies and make investments that really prioritize advancing community stewardship, growing wealth, improving quality of life, and addressing past harm, getting to those root causes, and having a practice of care to actualize our visions. And so this could really be actually applied as a rapid thought-based exercise. It could also be done if there's a lot of data and time and a mapping analysis, which is really fantastic. But in fact, there's actually research that says our own local knowledge is not far off from what the data tells us. So this makes it really easy for anyone to pick up and to quickly apply kind of a thought exercise into our busy schedules. And it also leaves space for us to tell stories. And we don't always approach climate vulnerability from the climate lens, but from who we are as people. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just take us through a very simplified version of this process and what it looks like. So it's really, I broke it down here, but it's really just a couple of steps, and it starts with what is our goal? What is our project? For example, let's say we want to develop affordable housing near transit, and we're in Atlanta and it's around the Beltline. We'll think about what climate stressors or non-climate stressors do we have? We're facing increasing temperatures. There's lack of green space and connectivity, and gentrification are coming up. And then we think about these stressors and how do they interact with each other? They may lead to worsened air quality or potentially respiratory illness as a result. So we want to think about those interacting factors. And then solutions, which are really important. We don't want to leave people with that sort of doom and gloom. But how can we think about preserving that affordable housing or developing housing that's actually in the neighborhood, ensuring that we're integrating cooling features that address increasing temperatures into the designs, ensuring that housing and green space is connected, and that partners have a sense of community ownership of the nearby parks, housing, and infrastructure. And we can go to the next slide. And any assessment really has to come with the support and funding for implementation, which leads me to this final strategy, which is around technical assistance and financing. And part of the Spark initiative, we do support capital projects at the local levels and cities, and at the time of financing. So one of the things we've been doing is bringing this TA in at the local level to the project level. And the goal is to actually identify climate resilience through this capital entry point. So instead of having a separate sort of climate program or incentive as a starting point, our CDFI, our community development finance institution partners, which includes enterprise, have worked to integrate climate costs and into our existing financing and grants and loans to demonstrate that the climate and the social benefits are all integrated to people. So next slide, and I'll just leave us with, again, everything is connected. These are some of the principles here and some actions that are centered around them. And you can read them, but as a climate and environmental leaders, to get to equity, we must be part of these conversations about housing, about race, about climate, if we want to ensure that resilience reaches people. So we've covered, these intersections, these intersectional pieces around climate equity in the built environment and how we came to this question of displacement, but also building resilience. And we need to help others make these connections because not only do we want our homes and our communities to be green, but we want our green homes and resilient projects to be just. So I hope that you'll join me in sharing this information and that we can continue to support one another. Thanks. And I just included some of the resources that I mentioned. We can maybe figure out how to share them out with you in links. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Marissa. Yeah, we'll definitely, we're obviously recording this webinar, but we'll be sure to include those links in our follow-up email to everyone. I just want to, now that we're moving into the panel discussion, I just want to pick up really quick on one thing that you just said, that there's sort of introducing these topics and these themes, and then there's doing it, right, and doing the work. And I appreciate that you hit on the vulnerability assessments and the fact that there are tools out there to actually do some of this work, to take it from concepts to the ground to do this work. And I think it would be great also if the vulnerability assessment is also something that we could share out. I think that would be interesting to do as well. So if you have that easily accessible and want to drop that in the chat, that would be great. Well, I just want to, there's so many, honestly, so many things that I think connect what the three of you said, and just so many great intersections from so many different angles. One thing I was curious about, just based off of your three experiences, how are some ways, and Marion, you and I were discussing in the recent past, HUD has sort of changed its guidelines for one-off community engagement events when they're providing funding to multiple community engagement events. So just curious how you three see, there's coming to the community once and trying to get interest from people, there's listening, but how do you keep people engaged? And also, how do you make sure that it's not just one-off consultations from whoever the powers that be might be, engaging in this planning process? So, just would be curious to hear from all three of you. How do you keep people engaged? And number two, how do you make sure that they're not just one-off consultations from both ends, and that people are going to the community time and time again through the whole planning process?
I can kick us off if that's okay.
That would be great.
So I think when I think about this, I think kind of the first step is really sort of determining, listening to the community and kind of figuring out what they need to participate fully. I think this has a lot to do with, thinking about people whose first language isn't English. How would they be able to show up and engage multiple times in an event? Or people with disabilities, like how are they going to be able to show up, or are you going to come to them? And so I think, if we really want people to be involved throughout a whole process, we really need to make the process easy for them to be involved in the first place. And I think a lot of planning and recovery processes are pretty complicated and hard for people who don't have 9-to-5 jobs and a little bit of extra time on their hands to participate. One of my big dreams is that we actually pay community members as full-time participants in these types of engagements. That would be my dream world, because I think at the end of the day, they're putting in labor like we're putting in labor 9-to-5 for the jobs we work at. And so I think that would be a really powerful way to ensure that people can be there the whole time. So I'll stop there and hand it over to our friends here.
I'll jump in since you were being really practical with some of those ideas there. One of the most important things I learned in college was the power of free food, right? So if you're going to be doing evening meetings and you promise that there's going to be food, then your parents can come because they don't have to worry about cooking food for their kids, right? And maybe include childcare. That's worked for a lot of communities. And then Mihir, I think the second part of your question was about keeping people engaged. And I think really what works there is letting them know that you heard them. So starting off kind of subsequent engagements with a recap of what you heard, and then maybe moving toward, what you didn't understand or what maybe was missing, or trying out some ideas about if we did this, would that be meeting your need? Really treating the community as the resource that they are. It's not that they told you something once and you can just run off and fix it. It's understanding that there is power in those communities to shape the response that will ultimately meet their needs.
Do you just real quick, so do you have a vision of how that would or does happen in terms of, I guess, going back to the practical, is there a way that you sort of see that play out?
Well, the first thing would be pacing. So understand that it's going to take a little bit longer to make your plan if you're going to be sharing it with the community. You may need to slow it down. You can't necessarily just roll out a blueprint and think everyone's going to be able to read it and understand it. So you might need to kind of come up with a slide deck with some pictures of things so people can really envision what you're talking about. Just trying to put out there the things that enable people to see the future just a little bit. People love that when you can take the mystery out of change. And so thinking about ways that you can communicate that don't require a lot of reading, that don't require the ability to necessarily read maps or blueprints or whatever, but making it simple. It doesn't mean it's dumbing it down. It just means you're communicating very clearly in a way that people can understand. And may need to require interpreters, and depending on whether you have visually impaired language, whatever. So you need to know that about your community to make that really meaningful for them. And when you do that, when you treat people with respect, when you let them see what's happening, when they see that you have incorporated what they were talking about, that tends to keep people coming back.
Yeah, absolutely. Respect is a big thing. Marissa, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you both nailed it. And Jamie, I think there's some examples now of folks in, I think, places like King County have developed equity frameworks, which include actual funding for participation. There's a couple of examples. I think in the Bay Area, MTC has been looking at funding community-based organizations and coalition partners. So that is not, it's still a big dream to make that, universal, but there's some precedence there that is happening, and I think working. And I think, in addition, these really addressing kind of a lot of the barriers, right? Transportation, childcare, spiritual beliefs, immigration status, meeting times and scheduling, and historic patterns of, planning practices that haven't addressed, community needs. So, coming back to those practical pieces around leading with equity in the beginning, right? Working with real people, respecting that local knowledge, showing that you respect it, and considering the history and the culture, right? And I think it's critical to purposely enable leaders and policymakers to protect people in advance, thinking about in advance of the disaster, in advance of an event, not always possible, but really important, I think. I think one of the things you were starting to refer to, Marion, is like these feedback loops, right? Like, how are we going back to people and letting them know that they've been heard, and getting, being in partnership, right? So that there's a collective solution that we all kind of care about. It seems, it sounds easier than it is, right? But it's important to really be thinking and engaging from the beginning all the way through. I think sometimes, in history, there's been like an engagement process and then that's it, right? So how does that engagement, how are you funding, how are you getting the resources for that engagement that lasts all the way through till implementation? It seems kind of like a big ask in some ways, but it's really important because it's gonna have a better outcome with all of those integrated and co-benefits in the end.
Marissa, let me jump in to say how glad I am that you mentioned kind of that concept of like fatigue with all of this, right? We've been through a planning process before at the community level or the neighborhood level or whatever, and nothing came of it. So I think part of how you keep people coming is acknowledging that you're going to put money on the table, right? That you're going to spend. I see a great question from Adelaide in the chat about how do you do this without being alarmist, without scaring people? If your community hasn't been through a disaster yet, how do you get their attention, but not at the right level? And I think that's about acknowledging that there is risk, talking about climate change. Almost everybody believes in climate change right now. We don't have to make that case really anymore, but then to start to say, well, we don't know what that means here, but we think we need to make some changes and we're willing to spend the money that we need to do to keep everyone safe. And then,
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Marion. And, this again seems so basic, but it's really important, the language that we talk about. I think there was a paper that came out recently around the vulnerable city, and it was defining like frontline and recipient and climate haven cities. And, I think there's benefit to that because we'll learn what's working in some typologies of places versus others. But I think we also need to be careful. Like, if my community is not a climate haven, does that mean it's a climate not haven? Like, what does that mean? And so, I think we need to be really thoughtful about how are we integrating these processes throughout, so it's not this place is better than this, and this place is going to garner that investment, and this place we're not going to invest in.
Yeah, I just want to chime in, agree with what you both are saying. And yeah, I really appreciate this question because sometimes when I talk about what I do, it can get doom and gloom pretty quickly. And I think people also assume it's doom and gloom. But I think one way I think about the disaster risk, and the reason that I got into this work was that it touches so many pieces of our lives. It's housing, it's transportation, it's community engagement. When we think about what's happening with climate change and what can happen in a disaster, we're touching every fabric of everyone's lives. And I think for me, that's a really powerful organizing tool of like, when we organize for housing justice, we're also organizing for disaster justice, and we're organizing for transportation justice. We're also organizing for disaster justice. And I think making the connections to the issues that your community is facing is undoubtedly linked to disaster risk and how we can be more prepared for what's coming. And so, and I think for me, that's optimism, right? When we see the community organizing on these really crucial issues, like that's going to be how we build resilience to the next disaster when climate change really starts to hit your community. Losing my words, getting excited, but.
No, we appreciate, and I think that's so spot on, Jamie. It reminds me of something Marion mentioned earlier, which some of the ways that we define resilience is that is that we bounce back or prepared with that with minimal outside assistance. So how do communities, neighbors prepare each other, lift each other up, help each other out to bounce back quicker in a stronger way? And it also ties into another comment or question that Adelaide has just put in the chat of what would be helpful for residents is to hear from each other. And she mentions that these national initiatives help bring those voices towards the front. And Jamie, I think through the Community Powered Resilience website, that's obviously a core of what you're trying to do. And Marissa, same with the Spark program, obviously. Is there anything that either of you would like to share regarding that in terms of how you've seen residents helping each other and hearing from each other in terms of their stories, whether it be for disaster recovery or preparedness or whatever it might be?
Sure, I can jump in. And since we're talking about storytelling, I'm happy to share my own personal story because I think it really hits on this question. So I'm from Wilmington, Delaware. I came to Enterprise because I grew up, I was raised by a single mom in subsidized housing. And so I'm really familiar with building camaraderie and support in a really powerful way. So when I was in high school, our apartment flooded and we needed a lot of support from our neighbors, and everyone just showed up at our doorstep with food and treats and goodies and like love and support for how we could engage with the apartment complex and what we could do next. And people had been through it before. And so I think at the end of the day, that is what drives me in this work, because that's how I think we're all going to be safe for whatever is happening in our communities. It's the people next door who show up. And so when I talk about my work, I often say, the best thing you could do today is knock on your neighbor's door and ask them how they're doing and get to know them, grab their number, because it saved me and my family a number of times when I was growing up. And so now I like to be the neighborhood greeter and pie baker, which I know sounds like a sitcom, but I think it's really powerful, and I think it goes a long way. So
thank you for sharing that with us. I think that's exactly what we were speaking to, and that is truly powerful, not just from a story sharing perspective, but also hearing it from someone we know and one of our own. So thank you so much for bringing that up and sharing that. Marissa, anything kind of along the same lines from any of the Spark programs, and any stories or instances that you've seen residents kind of hearing from each other and help move towards the common goal of whatever project it might be?
Yeah, and I think one of the points here is, whenever possible, starting from the vision and the goal of community voice, because it may not always enter from that perspective of climate change. It may come from that perspective of home, to your point, Jamie, of food, sharing food, of camaraderie. And I think that is a way of just growing the network, building power, having a network of support, again, for these shared goals. And I think there's different contexts. I think that could happen certainly within community. And I think it's also, I think that's why it's important for all of us to share each other's stories, that we can collectively work across lines of, owners and residents and policymakers. So whenever possible, we want to work towards that vision, and it helps us to kind of get out of that doom and gloom space. But it also, once we're actually solving for what we want, like we want increased wealth, we want to end poverty, it allows us to ensure that equity doesn't become a side benefit, that when we start with the vision, like safe and healthy affordable housing, or, whether it's food justice or access to transportation, and then build that resilience into it, I think that's when we really can ensure that people are better off in the long term. Can't always be possible, because there's always going to be something urgent that comes up in some places that we have to solve that problem. But as much as we can, really building that practice in of taking the time to listen and share with each other, I think that's where we're going to get the best outcomes.
Yeah, I think actually, Marion, in our first session, you had said something which is right along the lines of what Marissa said, where we want to, when we're talking about equity through resilience planning and community resilience, we want to make sure that and remind ourselves that equity is a process. It's not an end goal, right? It's not like, okay, tomorrow we have equity and we're all good, right? It's a process. And it's not just something that happens overnight. So I appreciate you saying that. We just a couple of minutes here to wrap up. Anyone else that we have time for probably one more question? Otherwise, I'll give all our panelists maybe 30 more seconds if you want to just like give us a one wrap up of some, I guess, glimmer of hope, since we're on this theme of removing toxic resiliency out of the way, in terms of, I guess, maybe what do you see as maybe the best way to engage in community resilience, or what is just one final note of your perspective on community resilience would be great from each of you. Marion, why don't we start with you?
I'm a big believer in no bad ideas, right? So do some brainstorming. Make sure you set up an environment where people can talk and there's no criticism of ideas. Just get all the ideas out there, because those will spark new ideas. At the end of the day, you still, as the owners, the developers, the people writing the checks, you still have the control over what comes out on the other side. So don't worry about needing to react to everything. If people are talking about something that's going to be, crazy expensive or whatever else, just let the people talk and listen, and you'll get to some really cool ideas, I bet.
Jamie?
Sure. That's a good one. I'm also a big believer in community organizing and advocacy. And I think one thing that I think is really powerful is how can we listen to the advocacy efforts of the people most impacted and support those causes, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level for what they're asking for. Because to my earlier point, I think that those things that they're asking for are going to contribute to their long-term resilience in the long run. So, tenant protections, the right to housing, things like that we're hearing from people, how do we support those efforts with our own community organizing work, or funding those efforts, or calling our legislators about what people are asking for. So pass to Marissa.
These are so good. I don't know if I can top it, but I'll just say, these, compounding crises, again, I think really require holistic, intersectionable, complementary solutions. And hearing about NDRC and, some of the pieces coming out of the federal government, I'm hopeful that there's this opportunity for more alignment, but it comes, I think, again, it comes from the ground up. We have the opportunity to be here, and I just there's a role for each and every person in this room and on this call to bring their expertise, bring their personal experience, bring your personal human being knowledge to the table to come up with these complete solutions. And I have some hope that given all of us on the call today, that there's some chance of us thinking outside of and doing things in a complete and holistic way.
That's perfect. That's a perfect way to wrap. Thank you so much, Marion, Jamie, Marissa, for this fruitful conversation and sharing your stories and ideas of how do we make livable communities for everyone and for all. So again, I appreciate it so much. Thank you, everyone, to the audience for joining. We really appreciate it. We'll be sure to send out this recording along with some of the resources that we've talked about today. And again, just as a reminder, our next public session will be focusing on navigating funding opportunities, and that will take place on December 2nd. And we hope to see you all there. Thanks again, everyone. And for our cohort members, we'll see you at 2:10 on the other link for our meeting. Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you. Have a great day.